First of all, a disclaimer. The story I'm about to tell you is from a possible world, not quite from our own world, but very close. The Lydian chromatic concept is best known as the origin of chord scale theory, a common idea in jazz improvisation pedagogy. When a musician wants to improvise over a chord symbol, like say A flat minor 9, they need a pool of notes to draw from. Those might be notes from the song's melody, or more likely the notes of the chord itself, in this case A, C, E, G, and B flats. What chord scale theory does is propose that any chord has a parent scale, or more accurately, a parent mode from which it's derived. In this case, our A flat minor ninth chord comes from the A flat Dorian mode. It is therefore an A flat Dorian chord. And what's more, any other combination of notes in the parent mode will also be an instance of an A flat Dorian chord. All of these chord structures, including our original chord, are different ways of implying the sound of the parent Dorian mode. So the mode not only provides a larger pool of notes to draw from, but it also becomes a way to identify any possible chord, not by its structure, but by the overall sound it implies. So the chord symbol A minor 7 flat 5 can be rewritten as A diminished minor from the diminished minor mode. C7 sharp 11 can be rewritten as C Lydian dominant from the Lydian dominant mode, and D7 flat 9 flat 13 can be rewritten as D alt from the alt mode. This notion of a parent mode comes from the Lydian chromatic concept and is captured in its most widely quoted sentence, "The Lydian scale is the sound of its tonic major chord." Now, this sentence holds scale and chord, whole and part, in opposition, and yet it also claims that they're the same. Scale resides at the key level, a higher level of abstraction than chord, and chord serves a functional role within the key. To propose a shared sound brings each into the other's domain. It suggests that a notion of key can exist at the chord level, and also that there's more to the sound of a chord than the chord itself. This sentence captures the moment just before something radically new happened, just before chord was subsumed into mode. It was at this moment of potential when, in order to achieve or even to express this merger, the two ideas still needed to remain distinct. But back to our own world for a moment. A merger of mode and chord isn't exactly what happened. We ended up with something much stranger. This is a widely used method book from 1995. Practical methods like this one tend to best capture how musicians at large are formulating these ideas, and chord scale theory is captured, perhaps inadvertently, on a single page. It goes like this. Chords and scales are the same. Although everybody uses the expression play this scale on that chord as if the chord and scale were two different things, the scale and chord are two forms of the same thing. But chords are different. Since we're going to be thinking of scales and chords as two forms of the same thing, let's review the rules for three basic chords. And scales are different. Because you can play more than one scale on a given chord, the scales provided here are in the category of basic first choices. So, use your ears. Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, two giants of jazz, played different scales on half-diminished chords. Keep an open mind and open ears. Somehow, our version of chord scale theory never quite merged the idea of chord into its parent mode, nor did it quite move beyond the conventions of triadic chord structures or their role in functional tonality. We started down this path, but then we stopped somewhere murky along the way. The chart on the next page shows where we landed. Chords on the left are paired with modes on the right, not symbols that merge the two. Chords and modes are functional degrees of a major key. They're not infused with their own notion of key. And there's the curious presence of the avoid note, which improvisers are taught to steer clear of. Avoid notes flag a dissonant minor ninth between two chord tones if that note isn't specified in the chord symbol. So avoid notes also reinforce a conception of chords as structures, especially as triadic structures. I don't know about you, but I miss our A-flat Dorian chord. Could the Lydian chromatic concept have done anything to avoid this mess? Russell was working with jazz lead sheets, which rely entirely on chord symbols. What was to become chord scale theory was only one station stop along the way to his larger project, to bridge the gap between the lead sheet and full chromatic freedom. That's why it's the Lydian chromatic concept and not just the Lydian concept. This came at a time in the late 1950s when neither functional tonality nor atonality quite satisfied the intuitions of jazz improvisers. Russell had a delicate task to articulate a new way of thinking that absorbs both tonality and atonality, that allows each to continue on and yet also to be transformed. It wouldn't have occurred to Russell that chord symbols could be the site for this kind of work. They were far too entrenched, both in tradition and in current practice. Scales, however, offered some uncharted territory, and they had a clear upper limit, the chromatic scale, which could represent both structure and freedom at the same time. Now, what if Russell had slipped one extra assertion into his theory? What if, based on his idea of a parent mode, he had claimed that two identical chord structures, each derived from different parent modes, were fundamentally different chords? What if he'd said that a chord is not separable from its parent mode? This may look exactly like a major triad, but it's actually a Lydian triad. Back in our possible world, that's exactly what he did. This is a widely used method book from that possible world in 1995 called Chromatic Polymodality. The author was a working musician who had a teaching job to help support his playing habit. Here on page 34, there's a chart showing the relationships of individual triadic chord structures to their parent modes. There are two things in the Lydian chromatic concept that ultimately led to charts like this one. First is perhaps the most extraordinary sentence in the whole book. When we strike all the 7 tones of the C major scale simultaneously, the fourth of the scale F seems to emerge as the tonic. Now, Russell gave several different justifications for placing the Lydian mode in a privileged position. One was a tonal justification that drew on the theories of Paul Hindemith. Another was an appeal to the overtone series, but this one sentence developed a reputation as the essence of Russell's concept. To suggest playing all the notes of a mode simultaneously is to suggest a yet unordered field of tonal potential, and to allow one note to emerge from this field as the tonic suggests a model for what Russell may have meant by the sound of a musical structure. But this sentence is about much more than a parent mode. There's no musical context from which the sound of Lydian seems to emerge. It emerges from something larger, something perhaps even metaphysical. The Lydian mode just seems to emerge, period. And so Lydian takes on an ontological significance. It's the parent mode of modes themselves. The second and more practical motivation for charts like this were Russell's own charts. He provided resources for matching chords with their parent modes, but he never gave an explanation for exactly how each chord was matched with each mode. In light of an ontological Lydian, being able to derive the true parent sound of any chord structure became a very important concern for musicians. It turns out this can be done relatively easily by building up the notes of each mode in consecutive thirds known as extension, so that they align with the notes of a fully extended triadic chord structure. 3 rules that were already standard practice for writing chord symbols made this possible. First, preserve the root triad. That is, there can be no alterations or doublings on degrees of the root triad. For example, an altered chord could have both a major and minor third, but that would break this rule, so it has a raised ninth instead. Second, build the highest extension possible without any breaks in successive degrees. An augmented dominant chord could have a 13th, but that would break this rule, so it's perfectly happy with its augmented 5th, and it only extends up to a sharp 11th. And third, put any doublings in the lowest possible extension, but not in the root triad. A diminished chord could have either a minor or major 13th, but instead it has either a diminished or a major 7th. It's the top of this chart, however, the chord mode symbols themselves, that were the most significant outcome of the chord mode merger. What was needed in each case was a single name that describes a mode, that also works as a chord symbol, and that's close enough to established practice to actually be adopted by musicians. Notice that some of the symbols are church modes, like Lydian, Dorian, Phrygian, and Locrian, and others are more modern mode names like major, dominant, minor, and diminished. Some of the symbols have connotations of functional tonality and would have already been familiar to musicians as common chord names. Others put a name to a less common chord family like augmented dominant, Lydian dominant, and alt. The story of how these symbols became widely adopted is fascinating, especially since it could only have happened in response to Russell's ideas. The names would have never stuck if Russell had proposed them outright. To help get a sense for how this happened, consider what exactly minor dominant means. Is it a hybrid of two modes, the dominant and the minor? Or is it an alteration of the dominant mode, dominant with a lowered 6th? Or is it a description of a chord structure, a dominant 7th in a minor key? These sorts of questions became the subject of fierce debate between musicians and created a cottage industry for music theorists, exposing a sharp and sometimes contentious divide between people who thought in terms of contexts and people who thought in terms of structures. This lively period occurred during the mid through late 1980s and became known as the diminished minor debates, named for the most commonly used chord symbol that can be read either as a hybrid mode or a description of a triadic chord structure. Ultimately, the mode symbols that stuck are an imprecise mixture of all of these different priorities, but that's exactly why they continue to work. In hindsight, these debates did the hard work of formalizing each different naming system, only so they could merge back together into a single system that could support them all. For the development of chord scale theory, what mattered most was that each name could, in the end, be interpreted as its own fully intact parent mode and not as an alteration of some other mode. Back to the daily lives of musicians, this kind of chart is still widely used because it provides a shortcut for matching any chord with a parent mode. Say you have a chord with a root, a minor 3rd, and a minor 7th. The chart shows you 6 parent modes that could have produced this chord structure. So you can decide whether this might be, say, a Dorian chord, or maybe a diminished minor chord. But there's a problem. You can respell the minor 3rd as a raised 9th, and this gives you 2 entirely different possible parent modes. So maybe it's an alt chord, or maybe a dominant altered chord. This realization was what put the final nail in the coffin for a triadic construction of chords. The merger of chord and mode had been achieved through triadic extension, and so it came along with embedded triadic values. The way to break free of these limitations was to replace triadic degrees with degrees of the parent mode. So as triadic chord symbols gradually went out of fashion in favor of chord mode symbols, chord scale theory began to look more like this chart on page 142. Each symbol on this chart represents a mode from the previous chart, but this reconception allowed something new to happen. Each mode can also be seen as an individual note, as a tonic that causes that mode to emerge from a common collection of notes. You can see this more clearly by drawing note names around the outer edge of the chart. So I'll go F, C, G, D, A, E, and B. These notes together form a collection, a field of potential called a polymodality. If any one of the notes is emphasized by any means in the music, its corresponding mode will emerge from the polymodality, just as Russell's Lydian had emerged from the simultaneous notes of the C major scale. Russell often referred to polymodes, but a polymodality, a field of tonal potential independent of a tonal center, is something that could only have happened after the advances of a chord mode merger. This chart represents 4 polymodalities on each concentric circle of the chart. By adding the rest of the notes around the outer edge, so I'll go G flat, D flat, A flat, E flat, B flat, you can see that each successive polymode, first the acoustic and then the octatonic and then the whole tone, expand to fill the full space of the chromatic scale, leading ultimately to a chromatic polymodality, hence the title of this book. From a historical perspective, this outcome is startlingly close to Russell's Lydian chromatic. It's a fully chromatic field of potential, and yet it's organized by the distinct tonal gravity of each polymodality, and in turn by the gravity of each parent mode within each polymodality. Any musical structure, even a single note, is subject to all of these gravitational forces at once, and it's up to the improviser to decide how to engage these forces. Mode, in the end, is a field of potential, and what's most extraordinary is that to get from any musical event to its parent mode, or its parent polymodality, or its parent chromatic polymodality, requires us to consider factors outside the musical event itself, perhaps even outside the musical work, perhaps reaching into the broader implications of the style, or into the culture at large, or even, as Russell suggested, reaching into a metaphysical realm. In our world, we still get hung up on questions like what key a pop song is in, or how to name the opening chord of Stairway to Heaven, much less what to do with Ravel or Machaut. It's heartening to know that there's a possible world in which a field of potentially helpful ideas has already withstood the test of time. Thank you.